Oh, snap, we're in the building, as the kids say. So, welcome to the webinar. Those of you that have joined us, as always, with any webinar you go to in digital marketing, we're going to wait a couple minutes so people can get the opportunity to join in. I also can't see how many people are in here. So, why don't you drop a comment and let me know where you're tuned in from? So much to talk about today. And for those of you that checked out the blog post that I wrote for Search Engine Land, a lot of this is what I discussed there, but we have more opportunity to go in depth because I'm just talking now. It's a lot easier to say a lot more when you don't have to write it all out, even though 29 pages in Google Docs before I turned it in. All right, so I'll give it another, let's call it 30 seconds, and then we will get it popping. Got some folks tuning in from Florida, Wyoming. How do I say that? Mauritius Island. We got Portland, Maine. Amazing seafood up there. NYC, of course, the home team. Cool. All right, I'm going to get this moving. Got some Orlando, somebody in Maryland. Cool. All right, let's talk about Search Master General. What up? Upstate New York. I see y'all shining. All right, let's talk about the SGE threat and how to mitigate your risk. So, first of all, I'm Mike King. You can follow me at iPullRank if you don't already. And as I like to say, I am not the real estate agent for that house right there. Cool. So I'm from an agency called iPullRank. If you're not aware of us, we're the best. So as you're trying to figure out, somebody tuning in from Philly, okay, that's where I'm from, by the way. As you're trying to figure out who you want to work with for SEO going into 2024 or even right now, you know who to call. Also, I am the CMO of a organization called AIPRM. It's a generative AI tool. It's a prompt management solution for ChatGPT. It's basically the cheat code for ChatGPT. So if you're using that language model, definitely recommend you check us out. And here's what it looks like. It gives you the ability to use all your prompts in our network from one click. You can set up voice and tone. There's all sorts of stuff you can do with it. All right, so let's talk about the threat of SGE. So it's just some quick background at Google I/O back in May. They introduced this idea, this pretty dramatic change to search. They talked about it being this experimental thing called Search Generative Experience, which effectively brings a lot more to the search. So first thing is that the query itself is more capable. So historically, the query can only be up to 32 words, and it's basically written in Orwellian newspeak. It's not really reflective of how any of us actually talk. And so, it's just a really specific way that you need to talk to Google in order to get what you want. We've got the new version of Slack, and I'm not really clear on how I turn off my, what do you call it? The messages or whatever. So I'm just going to close it and see what happens. Anyway, so then you got the AI snapshot. AI snapshot is Google looking to answer your question in an in-depth way. It includes a paragraph or several paragraphs explaining the answer. It's also showing the citations at this point. And then you're seeing, the links to the sources where it got its information from. And then below that, you've got the follow-up questions. And so users can go into that conversational mode, very similar to what Bing had introduced a few months ago as well. Then we saw more recently that Sundar, the CEO of Google, has indicated that they're going to continue to invest in this. They think it's a improvement. And in fact, if you look at some of the research to come out of the Google research team, there's a gentleman by the name of Andre, I can't remember his last name, but he's been with Google for a very long time. In fact, I think he used to be at Alta Vista before Google, but he talks about this idea of Delphic costs. So to boil it down in simple terms is that users never really wanted 10 blue links. That's what they got from search, but it's not what they wanted. And so what they ultimately want to do is get to the right answer as fast as possible. And so I think that, that's just something that engineers in search have known for a very long time. And they feel like SGE is a good step in the right direction for them. So they're going to continue to invest in it. They're making it faster. You can expect that they're going to roll it out in some form to the general population, potentially in the new year. So what's going to happen? The search demand curve is going to shift. And what I mean by that is, we have a lot of what we call head terms, keywords like computer or TV, where people don't really know what they want. They get a ton of search volume. What's going to happen is that more of that search activity is going to go to the chunky middle, as we call it, or the long tail, because Google is going to get better at understanding your queries, and users are going to realize that as they try new things. And also being that so many users are using different platforms like a ChatGPT, their queries are going to change. And so, betting so much on those head terms isn't going to be as valuable moving forward. Then the CTR model is also going to change because the AI snapshot effectively pushes everything down. Well, you're not going to get as many clicks to those standard organic results. And then rank tracking is also going to be a lot more complex. So right now you can do rank tracking just by scraping the server-side rendered version of Google. The AI snapshot is a client-side rendered component. And so now you've got to wait extra time as a rank tracking solution to pull down that information. And so that's going to drive up the costs for rank tracking as well. And then also when we think about these subsequent follow-up questions, if you want those, that is also going to drive the cost up more. And so the other thing is that these context windows being brought to search are going to change how results work. It's going to be a more hyper personalization. So if you've ever gone to ChatGPT and you've asked a question and then you ask another question, if you ask that second question in a blank or a new chat window, it's going to give you a different answer than what you got when you did it in a series of questions. And so that context window persists as you go through that discussion. So by that same token, when you do that in search, what was in that previous answer and what was previously considered will be carried through to then further personalize your results as you go through these different journeys. And so it's going to require that content speaks to multiple components of things to be able to be maintained throughout that search journey. So what do I mean by that, right? So if your query is auto insurance quote, and then someone goes down this path of, is $100 a month too much for car insurance? You need to have also answered that in your first document, your first page, if you want to maintain, that within that context, right? Because as Google goes through this, it's going to start to weed out what doesn't relate to that original context. And so you're going to have to think about your content in a more multidimensional way. So there's a question in here. Do you think we'll get a new Google Search Console metric for the number of times your page was cited and linked in SGE? We've already seen performance stats split from Google Discovery. I think there will ultimately need to be some sort of metrics in GSC. I'm not completely sure of what those are, but I definitely think that down the line, Google, if they're going to go in more of this direction, we're going to need more information to reinforce or for us to support being there, because in a lot of ways this is going to cut out a lot of traffic for a variety of different publishers. And so there needs to be something that creates a feedback loop so that publishers still see the value in being in Google, because of course, as we're going to discuss, the traffic is going to go down pretty significantly. And so we need to think about what is the value to these businesses that create this content effectively for a living. But I don't know exactly what Google's going to provide. So let's talk real quick about the state of SGE. So there are effectively two different ways that you will see the AI snapshot. It'll either ask you to trigger, so it says get an AI powered overview for this search, or it will auto trigger. So as soon as the page loads, you then see that animation indicating that the AI snapshot is coming. And so that in and of itself is going to be, surprising and potentially delightful for users that see this for the first time. And so they may have a higher propensity to wait because they're like, oh, what is this? Google has changed. And so that novelty is going to yield a change to behavior definitely in the short term. However, the long-term effect is going to be a function of like how fast is this, how high quality do users think it is as well. And so Google is continuing to experiment. They're trying to figure out the best ways to get ads in there. This specific screenshot was perhaps about a month or so ago. I'm not seeing it look like this anymore. And I think part of that is that big empty real estate is something that Google doesn't necessarily, see the value in. And so this is what I would call a shopping snapshot because, of course, there's the answer right there, but it's primarily trying to drive you to get directly to the thing that you might want to buy. So in this case, basketball shoes, I have, some things to consider that they're laying out here, but then directly below that is a series of things that I can buy right away. And there's a lot of different examples of this for a variety of different verticals and keywords and so on. But, effectively, it looks something like this. They give you some information directly, but they drive you directly to components that can be monetized. And so this is problematic for any of the affiliate publishers because they are effectively taking your review information, throwing it right here in the SERP, and then driving people directly to places that they convert, primarily driven by ads. And so they're cutting you out entirely. And again, why would you continue to provide this content if you're not going to make any money out of it? And so we're seeing some shifts in this version as well. I'm seeing a lot more of the auto triggered, but then asking to show more. So it's not pushing down so much of, the paid ads or the organic results on the page. It's really just giving the user the opportunity to see the AI snapshot if they want to. Then you've got the local results. And these are actually quite interesting because if you look at the carousel here, this I've seen be as many as 100 options that are being presented here. So it's really the same things that you're seeing in that list on the left and also the things that you're seeing in the SERP. And so it's really just a complete reposition of the content that's already there rather than like a rewrite of it in the same way that we see for the more informational or shopping SERPs. And then the last one here is the example of what I would call the informational SERP, because while it does also have some shopping links in it, it is a more informational experience, meaning that you're getting more of that review right there in the SERP. And again, this one is also a show more because Google is just looking for ways to figure out like, okay, how do we maximize this UX to be useful to people, but also, be able to continue to drive ads and so on. So it's an experiment. We don't know much about what Google is doing or what they will do, but we can infer from the information that we have about user behavior. And what do I mean by that? So there's a variety of studies out there. I believe I got this one from Backlinko where they talked about how 50% of Google users will click on a search result within 9 seconds. The max time that they would take is like 14.66 seconds. Or excuse me, no, that's the average time they would take, 14.66 seconds. Some people taking as long as like 50 seconds to figure out what they're going to click. And so I use that as the time period that which can be threatening for SGE, or excuse me, where SGE can threaten us. And what I mean by that is if on average people take up to 14.6 seconds, well, in some cases, the load time was much higher than that. And so in those cases, it's not necessarily threatening because the user isn't going to wait. They're going to just drop down and look at those standard results. And maybe when they come back to the SERP because they want to look at the second result or the third result, then it becomes more problematic because then this giant above the fold thing has appeared, and then you want to look through that. But typically we use that as the benchmark to determine whether or not that query will be threatened by SGE. Here's the problem. Before or earlier when this first rolled out, it was taking 11 to 30 seconds for those AI snapshots to load. So, in most cases, it wasn't that big of a deal because it was taking far longer than that cutoff period that we just talked about. Now, when we just did this on 91,000 queries, the AI snapshot was taking an average of 6.08 seconds to load. So that's an indication that most of these are going to be threatening to your standard organic search traffic. So again, we don't know how the click distribution is going to play out, but we do have some data on how people have reacted to the featured snippet. And so we know that on average, 35.1% of the traffic has gone to featured snippets. 46.1 historically has gone to organic results. And so we're using that as like kind of our benchmark number to stay around as we think about what the threat to the traffic is. And so if you read the blog post, I went into great detail on the model that we've built out, where we're taking in all the different features that appear in the SERP and weighting them and then determining what the traffic loss could be. And we built out these whole threat reports to do that. But just kind of telling you about the composition of what we're seeing in that 91,000 query data study that we did, we saw that the breakdown between informational, local, and shopping is as you see here. So a little over 51% of the queries that had AI snapshots were the informational ones, 17.6 are shopping, 31.31 are the local snapshots. And then we dig in a little further. Well, we only saw about 40% of the queries that we looked at had snapshots. So these other measures that we had, we're looking to see, okay, is there a generate button? Is there no snapshot at all? Just so we're covering all the bases of what Google might be showing and what might indicate whether or not the user can see that AI snapshot. But when we dig into this from a category perspective, because we had a keyword set that we use for tracking, we put together for tracking algorithm updates. And so we broke down the performance based on that. And as you can see here, it's the entertainment and sports keywords that had the highest average load time for the snapshot. And I think that's more of a function of those types of sites tend to be very ad heavy. So for Google to then go out, grab those pages, load them, extract components from them, it's going to take longer than some of these other categories. So it really just goes to show that, categories like auto, software, NGO, banking are under more of a threat than the entertainment and sports, even though they're all pretty well threatened here. And then as far as how is the AI snapshot composed? So what we did here is we looked to see, based on the citations, what positions are showing up in the snapshots the most. And so what we've seen of our data set is that position 1, 2, and 9 are the ones that show up the most. So, it's still very volatile. I don't necessarily say like, hey, you have to be in these positions in order to get into the citations. But this is just what we're seeing happening the most right now. And then as far as how many of the top 10 results get used the most, we're seeing that it's 6 out of the top 10 get used the most in composing that AI snapshot. So ultimately what we're doing is we're pulling all this data together to build out these reports for our clients so we can give them a sense of what the threat is. Again, using that model that I go into more detail on in the blog post, but ultimately it gives them, amount of traffic that is being threatened. We give them a threat level. We also give them all the keywords with all the data that we've pulled as well, so that they can see, what's going on there. And so if you want to get your threat report, we're doing it for free. It's not a big deal. I mean, it is a big deal because where else are you going to get it from? But if you want to grab one, just sign up here in the threat report. We'll reach out to get your data, and then we'll run it on our end. Okay, so what is retrieval augmented generation? This is really the computer science behind how all this works. So retrieval augmented generation is actually something that came out of the Facebook AI research team. It's called FAIR. And in fact, Neva, if you remember that search engine, you should. It hasn't been dead that long. They were the first ones to actually roll this out. They had this super powered featured snippet that was really robust in that it really answered the questions in great detail. And so, a lot of people were sharing screenshots from that, especially around coding, because it was doing a better job than just like surfacing something from, Stack Overflow or something like that. And so after Neva, and of course they're no longer around, they got folded into Snowflake. But after Neva, then Bing came out with their version, and then Google's search generative experience is using the same sort of concept. So Google, they actually didn't do SGE, or they didn't come up with the thinking or the technology around SGE as a result of what Bing was doing. Their research teams have been considering stuff like this, going back to 2021. In fact, I think their original paper on this is from late 2020. It's called REALM. REALM stands for Retrieval Augmented Language Model Pre-Training. And so this initial foray into this idea really just used language models to extract a specific fact to answer a question. So in this example, and again, this is using kind of the same sort of idea of how BERT works, where it's what's called a masked language model, where they cover words so they can't figure out what it is, and then they guess based on their training, what is the word that goes here. But effectively what happens is it's trying to identify the missing feature or the missing data point to answer the question. And so in this case, we paid 20 blank at the Buckingham Palace gift shop, and then it extracts facts from different documents in the data set to then get pounds as the missing word. So it can effectively extract information and then provide that as an answer to a question. Then the DeepMind team followed up with something called Retro, or Retrieval Enhanced Transformers. And this is the language model that's taking a large text database, using the transformers, and then providing that to the language model so it doesn't have to have as many parameters as a GPT-3 or whatever, and it can still generate text responses, answers to queries. And so what they found is that with 25 times fewer parameters, it could outperform GPT-3 or another language model called Jurassic 1. And then later they came up with something called RAR, or retrofit attribution using research and revision. And so it doesn't create text from scratch. It really pulls a bunch of what they call candidate passages and then re-ranks them to figure out which one's going to be the best for a given answer for a question. And then it may also rewrite it and so on, and then give you that output. So when Google talks about how SGE is built, they talk about PaLM 2 and MUM, PaLM 2 being the biggest released language model that they have, and then MUM being multitask unified model, something that they talked about back in 2021. But also under the hood, you've got Realm, Retro, and RAR that are all different mechanisms used for generating these responses. So if you want to learn more about these, they've got technical papers that you can read from the Google research team. So here's the Realm paper, here's the Retro paper, and here's the RAR paper. And the reason why I bring these up is that, especially right now with so much innovation happening so fast, you can learn exactly how Google works in ways that I haven't seen since like the early 2000s, where engineers were being very forthcoming on what they were working on. People like Jeff Dean giving also writing papers, but giving presentations about like the Google architecture and things like that. And for those of y'all that don't know, I'm actually finishing up a book called The Science of SEO. And I've spent a lot of time going through all that material and distilling it into, ways that SEOs can better understand how Google works. And in fact, if you read my blog post about what we're discussing here, that is very indicative of what a chapter looks like in my book. So sounds cool. How's it all work? Well, basically with Retrieval Augmented Generation, when you get a query, you are comparing that query, and the query could be a prompt or it can just be like a standard query in Google. And then it looks up a series of what are called document chunks. So they're not looking for full pages in the way that we know Google to work. They're looking for paragraphs or sentences that are most relevant to that query. And then all of those chunks have been brought back and then they're added to the prompt. And then all of that is sent to the language model to then generate the response. And so this is why getting content this way is going to be more accurate than just using a language model by itself, because language models don't have all the facts, right? Like they have a high propensity for hallucinating and making things up. But if you give it a series of facts from a search engine effectively, then it can use that to generate a response that's going to be more accurate. So this concept is actually so easy that I built a proof of concept called Raggle. And so this is me replicating what Google has done with SGE. And so here's an example of how this looks. So I looked up Condola Rashad because I was watching Billions last night, and I was just like, yeah, let me just get an example of a SERP that's going to be pretty full featured. And so I've added some additional features here. Obviously, one, telling you to come to this webinar that you're at right now, but I'm also giving you loading time so you can see how long this takes as you're going. And then also just some fun facts as well as you go. And so once it's done, because what I'm doing here is I'm pulling the top 20 results from Google and then throwing them into a language model or into an index, and then using that to write this response, and also give citations for those responses, just like how SGE works. And so another thing that I do, if you click these three dots that are right here, you get what I call this chunk explorer. So you can see in great detail the exact paragraphs that were used. And then you also have these numbers here where I'm scoring the cosine similarity effectively for relevance against the query that was put in here. So how does this work? One, I'm not scraping Google directly. I'm using a rank API platform called Avs API. And I'm getting the data for the SERP, and then I'm running it through a tool called Llama Index. Llama Index is a tool for creating vector indexes and also connecting with large language models to generate content based on the content that you have indexed. And then once the content is indexed from the SERP, then I put that in front of ChatGPT to generate that response for that query. So it's actually really simple. It's like 7 lines of code. Well, let me not undersell it or oversell it. First, you got to, pull back all the data from Avs API. Then you've also got to crawl those pages, and then you've got to extract the text. But the actual component of generating this content based on the results is exactly what you're seeing here. So I have all my documents, I put into an index, then I set up what's called a query engine, specifically the citation query engine, which allows me to get back the actual citations to indicate the URLs that that they're being represented in this copy. And then we do what's called similarity top K, which says, here's how many document chunks we should be using here. In this case, I'm saying 5. So it's the 5 most relevant to the prompt of the query. And then I can determine how big I want the chunks to be. So in this case, I'm indicating 155, which is just the number of tokens that should be used. The default is 512. And some of the papers I've read from Google, it said they will go out to 1024, but based on what I see in SGE, it doesn't look like they're that long. And so then the final line here is just saying, give me a response that says answering the following query in 150 words. And so the query is added on here. So in this case, the example I showed you is just adding the word Condola Rashad here. And then that is what's being sent to ChatGPT along with the most relevant chunks to that query. So there's a few limitations to my proof of concept. One, it doesn't do follow-up questions. Two, it's not responsive at all. And in fact, sometimes the way the HTML for the SERP comes through may be kind of mangled, and so it doesn't look perfect. But what do you want from me? It's a proof of concept. Nobody paid for this. And it also only does the informational snippet. So you can play with it at raggle.net or at the link that has been dropped into the chat. So how do we optimize for SGE? That's obviously your next question, right? So let's talk a little bit about how search engines work in general. Search engines follow what's called the vector space model. And so if you've heard anything about vector embeddings, which power both natural language processing and natural language generation, so things like ChatGPT, what happens is you take your query and you vectorize it, and then you plot it in multidimensional space. And then you take all the documents that you think are going to be related to that query, and you vectorize those, and you plot those in multidimensional space. And then the ones that are physically closest are going to be the most relevant documents to that query. So at the end of the day, it's all linear algebra. It's not like someone qualitatively saying your page is better than that. It's really how well it matches up with the query. So when Google introduced BERT, they effectively were able to improve their ability to vectorize content. Back in the day when we were using like TF-IDF, I feel like the emphasis on that was weird. TF-IDF, we had what were called sparse embeddings, things that didn't capture a lot of information. BERT introduced this idea of what are called dense embeddings. And so I don't know if y'all remember, but a few years ago, Google talked about this idea of passage ranking, where they could, score things or understand things down to the paragraph level in a page. And so this is a concept that's related to what's called dense retrieval. So kind of a quantum leap forward in how information retrieval is done, in that they're able to figure out, on a granular level, which sentence is most relevant here, or which paragraph is most relevant here, or which section of this page is most relevant here, given the query. And so that's why you're able to see things like this in the SERP, where Google is able to highlight specifically in a sentence what is most relevant to your query. Now, this is the same concept that's related to chunks. These are the passages that are related to it. And so what Llama Index is doing is figuring out what are the chunks in this content, and then calculating that similarity to then provide that to the prompt. So let's do an example real quick, right? Keyword is BMW i8. And so we have the AI snapshot here. But what's really interesting is if you click on any of these results in the carousel, Google appends what we call fraggles to those URLs, so that you can go exactly to that sentence in Chrome. I don't know if all browsers support this, but I know Chrome does. So it can show you precisely which sentence was used from this document, or page rather, to inform that AI snapshot. And a given page can, have more than one of these in it. And you'll see that by looking at the individual citations. But nevertheless, just for example purposes, as you're seeing in this URL, the text equals, that's that Fraggle, which then gets you to this highlighted section here. And shout out to Cindy Crum. Fraggles is her term for this. And, I think that works. And so what I did for this query is I looked at all the Fraggles that were highlighted for this result. And then I wanted to get a sense of like, okay, how is Google ranking these? Like, I want to be number one in that carousel. So what is it that I need to do? Right. And so the first thing I did is I looked at the relevance by doing cosine similarity after vectorizing each of these sentences and then comparing it against the keyword. Well, this doesn't actually hold up in the way that I would want, right? Like you would expect that the most similar documents would be the ones at the top of the list. In this case, it's not the most similar, but it is, some of the most similar. So it's not a clear one-to-one explanation here. And then I was like, all right, well, it's enough of some, like it's directional to some degree. So let me take this a step further and see if I can find something a bit more definitive. And so what I did instead is I looked to see uh, if how do these compare against the paragraph that was created here, this paragraph in the AI snapshot. And so in this case, I actually find a stronger relationship. So the paragraph that is most similar to the AI snapshot is the one that's number one in this list. And so when I did this across a bunch of keywords, it's actually held up. And so, my working hypothesis is that if you want to be number one here in that carousel, then you're going to want to have the Fraggle or the paragraph that is going to be most relevant to what's actually generated by Google in the AI snapshot. So how do we mitigate traffic losses for SGE? Well, one, I think we just need to like manage expectations in general, right? Like just like we do with a site migration or something to that effect. We got to tell people like, hey, we should expect some losses when this rolls out. And then you've also got to understand what keywords are under threat. So I'm not aware of any other tools out there that will give you the SGE data. I suspect that rank tracking tools are going to roll something out soon, hopefully. But in the meantime, do your SGE threat report with us, and we can let you know what keywords are under threat. And these other ones are all number one because they're equally important to me. One, you're going to have to reprioritize your focus to the keywords that are not under threat. And so what I mean by that, after you identify the ones that are highly likely to lose traffic, maybe don't focus so much there moving forward. Maybe, build your links to the keywords that are less likely to be threatened. Maybe focus on, optimizing your content around those, because if we have keywords like head terms specifically that are not going to drive traffic for us in the future, there's no reason for us to invest in those now, if they're not already ranking. And then finally, for the keywords that you really want to continue to drive traffic to, the ones that are under threat, you're going to want to figure out like which passages are appearing in the AI snapshot so you can better optimize those so that they can rank better in that carousel. All right. So another thing that I want to talk to you about, and I have another blog post brewing. In fact, I was going to drop them both on the same day, but I figured that was too much mic for y'all. And so I want to talk about the content opportunity of retrieval augmented generation. So one, there's a lot of synergy between knowledge graphs and large language models. As you can see in this, Venn diagram here, a lot of things that knowledge graphs do well, large language models do not, and vice versa. Like you can't generate content from a knowledge graph, but you have a lower likelihood of that content being accurate just with a large language model. And so when you combine the two, you end up getting content that's far better and far more accurate. And from my perspective, because search engines are using, large language models at this point, and also are building knowledge graphs and using structured data, I think that we need to get away from just using structured data for rich snippets. And in fact, rich snippets are going away in droves right now, right? Like you see the how-to FAQ markup not showing anymore, but the large language model aspects of Google will continue to use it. So it makes sense for you to mark it up for all the vocabularies for schema.org now, not just the ones that we're going to give you star ratings or whatever, Google is showing. So a lot of organizations are doing retrieval augmented generation themselves using knowledge graphs or their own knowledge bases. And so I think this is a good opportunity for the SEO community to adopt the same idea so that we can generate better content based on facts and based on data that we collect. And effectively, this is the way that we have been, moving towards using large language models for content here at iPullRank, and also why we don't run into the issues that a lot of people are having, where their traffic is dropping as a result of the helpful content update. So doing this is actually not much different from the code that I showed you for how I built my SGE proof of concept. The example here, I could put in the sitemap URL for a given website, and then it'll pull down all the URLs and all the content and put those documents into an index. And then again, the same approach that I just walked you through, you give a prompt, and then it's going to use all that information, or at least the most relevant information to the prompt, to generate your content. And so this is just a good way to better inform voice and tone, and also a good way to incorporate actual facts from existing data. So, this is just an example of it using an existing website, but you can use any content, whether that's PDFs, whether that's, documents that you just have on your machine, or whatever it is, so you can get higher quality content from a large language model. And so what this looks like, from our perspective, because we're really into content strategy, and I completely believe, in fact, I wrote a blog post about this. Generative AI has a content strategy problem. A lot of people are just doing things left to their own devices. And when you don't have that consistency, you're not going to have the consistency in the output. And so the approach is really like, figure out your goals and your target audience, figure out your content formats, figure out which LLM you're going to use, because you don't have to use ChatGPT. You can use Llama 2, you can use Claude, you can use any number of things that are out there. Then you want to figure out which content assets you want to create your index around. And so a lot of this, and sorry, I skipped the workflow and integration points. You definitely want to figure out how you want to incorporate this in your existing, workflows, because completely upending your workflows around this stuff is going to be very difficult, because people just have to adopt that stuff. But then figure out which content assets you want to use, right? Like you want to use things like white papers, PDFs, like things that aren't commonly seen in the top 10 results, that have a lot of good information. And this is how you can get around the information gain problem, because Google is specifically looking for pages that are saying things that other pages are not. And so if you're looking for content assets that don't currently appear in Google, you're going to have a higher likelihood of having content generated that has a higher information gain. So once you have your list of curated assets, then you index them, and then you're going to want to build out a series of prompts to support what you want to create. Once that's like vetted and you make sure your prompts are actually working, then you can run those prompts on that index content and then get content that's going to be far more viable and will perform in organic search a lot longer. So for those of you that are using AI PRM, you are awesome. Those of you that are not, what are you doing with your lives? But anyway, we are building out a feature for AI PRM for building out custom indexes and then doing retrieval augmented generation directly within ChatGPT. And so as an example, if you were to ask, and Christoph Kemper is the founder and CEO of AI PRM, and he shows an example here where he asked ChatGPT, what does Kemper think about every day? And then ChatGPT basically says, I don't know. But then once we have a custom index, you say, okay, what does Kemper think about every day? And for those of you that don't know him, he actually also runs a software platform called Link Research Tools. He's been in the link building space for like 20 years. And so then ChatGPT responds, well, Kemper thinks about links every day, which is very accurate, right? And then it's also showing the source document that it got that information from. So this is coming to ChatGPT, and it's going to make all of this a lot easier. But for those of you who aren't using ChatGPT or aren't using AI PRM, you could build out workflows around this using Llama Index, like I showed you. So one more thing, there's a lot of papers and frameworks out there about this idea of fact verification using, knowledge graphs and so on. And historically, Google has said that they don't do any sort of fact verification in data that they've indexed and so on. But I think at this point, with the deluge of content that's coming as a result of generative AI, it's going to be difficult for them not to do this in the future. And so you may want to think about, like, how can you incorporate this sort of idea in your generative AI pipelines so that you can verify that the content you're generating is also factual. And then that way you don't run into anything that might be added to the helpful content update in the near future if it doesn't already have things like this in it. So rolling the credits, get your SGE threat report. We are standing by, ready to roll those out to folks. And that's all I got. I'm down to take any questions if we have any. And Garrett, where you at?
Yeah, oh Mike, that it's so much fun because it's like, for those of you who aren't familiar, my name's Garrett. I'm demand generation manager at iPullRank, and we talk about this stuff like all the time. And just seeing the way that Google has been testing and experimenting, we have these conversations. So yeah, everyone who has questions at this point, while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I'm curious, Mike, based on what you're saying about the context windows and wanting to stay on Google's radar with SGE, like making sure you're answering all the questions for content optimization, do you recommend that people focus on the skyscraper technique where you're trying to do everything in a single page? Or is it still okay to answer all the different questions as long as they're linked together?
Yeah, so I think bigger pages can work really well because of this idea of passage ranking. Like, Google is able to break things down within a page. It used to be this idea where you were like kind of diluting the page by talking about too many things. And I think at this point, having a single, more robust page is going to perform better than having a whole bunch of different pages. So I think tactically, a lot of people, and including us, historically have been like, all right, let's make every page for every long tail query and so on. And it worked really well. But I think that with these context windows, you're going to need a bigger page that speaks to various components of that journey so that you remain in that context window as those follow-up questions happen.
Very cool. And so if you guys have time, feel free. Okay, so we got a question from Martin, who's asking, I have a challenge as an in-house presently where the executive committee doesn't have the knowledge of how technical content has become. How can I simplify this to present like they're 5 years old?
Yeah, I think you just need to show them examples of queries that they may care about as a business and basically say, we are no longer going to be here unless we really invest in creating content that is saying something new or saying is more like definitive on the subject matter. And all the technical components that go into it, I don't think those necessarily matter to executive committees, right? Like, I think they care about, all right, what is the problem? Do you have a solution? How do we catch up, or how do we surpass what other people are doing? And I think it's very much about saying, like, all right, well, the problem is Google's going to take our traffic away unless we are more strategic on how we are creating our content. And the solution is really saying, like, hey, there are generative AI tools out there that we can be using. And me as a practitioner, I have a really good understanding of what these are. And strategically, here's what we want to do with this technology. I don't think they really care about the in the weeds components of like cosine similarity and how Google is determining relevance and chunk explorers and all that. That's for you as a practitioner. You still have to tell the story of like, here's what this means to the business. Here's my solution. Do you want to make money or not? Like, that's all you got to do.
There you go. David wants to know, what was the percent difference in likelihood for snapshots to appear in different category types, informational shopping? I think we covered that a little bit in your slide.
No, I didn't. His question is actually very specific because, like I said, I have 91,000 keywords, And then of the ones that created snapshots, these are the percentage breakdowns. He's asking me what's the likelihood percentage wise of an informational query to trigger a snapshot. That information I didn't calculate. I have the data. We'll provide that as a follow-up. I'll probably throw that in one of my subsequent blog posts. But we have the data. I just didn't calculate that.
Next up, Saj, hope I pronounced that right. For more informational results, not commercial or transactional, is there a different use case for how the results are displayed?
Different use case. I don't think I understand that question.
Can you articulate such kind of what you're thinking there? There was one other question earlier I wanted to touch on. Oh, so Joseph did want to expand on that. How will it display for reliable sources like government sites? In contrast, will opinion sources like blogs just die out, in your opinion?
I don't know that opinion sources are going to die out, because I think that Google is still looking for diversity of information, and in fact, I think they're doing more of that as a result of the helpful content update. I do think that they're going to give a lot of authority to more government sites, excuse me, for obvious reasons. But I think that the diversity of information is going to play a much bigger role here because of the fact that there's just so much content now. Like they can't manage millions of people being able to make infinite content. And so diversity of information has to be the core thing. But at the same time, the authority is going to continue to win. There's a post I saw on LinkedIn this morning where someone had done some analysis on bank rate. And, because everyone says like, oh, generative AI content, you're going to lose all your traffic, blah, blah. But this person showed that actually a lot of those generative AI pieces improved after these core and spam and helpful content updates. And so I do believe that authority still has a big component to play here. So it's going to be a combination of the authority and the diversity of information that's going to inform what's going to actually rank.
Back to EEAT. Chris wants to know theories on why the number 9 spot is showing up a lot in the SGE results versus those higher ranked pages.
I'm going to assume because positions 1 and 2 typically say enough that's different. And then positions 3 through 8 are people doing the skyscraper technique where they're just saying the same things in different ways. Whereas once you get to like 9 and 10, those are probably a bit more diverse. But, that's just my guess. It's hard to say. I don't have empirical evidence on that yet.
Interesting question from Brandy. She wants to know, do you think SGE will be used on Google Scholar? And what would that look like for academic content?
I think that's a interesting question indeed. I could see that being highly valuable on Google Scholar because that content is so dense. And in fact, as we think through creating these custom indexes for content that we create for our clients, that's the sort of stuff that we want in there because it's typically not the stuff that everyone is saying. There tends to be very specific opinions and analysis that can be used there. So I can see a lot of value in things being kind of summarized for Google Scholar content. And in fact, with Google introducing in Chrome the summaries of the web that like follow you as you go page to page, I mean, I can see them doing exactly that sort of thing in Google Scholar.
There you go. Joseph wants to know, should we be investing in knowledge graph syndication tools like Yext? And I want to add on to that. Can you speak to structured data in e-commerce? How important will that be?
I think structured data in general is super important. Again, for the same reasons that I said, because Google is looking to extract this information and then provide it in a variety of ways. Like that's always been true. It's just more true now in this mechanism wherein they're able to, turn that into natural language in really easy ways. So I think that investing in structured data in general is a good idea. Building knowledge graphs is an incredible idea. I don't necessarily know what the syndication tool does in Yext, So I can't necessarily answer that, but fundamentally, I believe that you should be building knowledge graphs for your own websites for use in a variety of ways, including for generating content.
Cool. One more question from Joseph actually is, are they training the model, or sorry, if authority wins, will domain ranking signals become more valuable?
Yeah, I don't think they've gotten less valuable. I think a lot of the links that people have been getting have gotten less valuable because Google is really good at determining how relevant content is. And so when you don't have parity between the source and target site, they're going to give you lower value for those links than you're going to get from a link that's very valuable or very relevant on both sides. So I think that's what we're seeing across the board right now, because just the improvements in machine learning as it relates to embeddings and things like that have allowed them to do this at web scale. And so I think SEOs are still building the links they've always built, and they're just not seeing the same return because Google has kind of turned the dial on those down for the more irrelevant links.
It's really interesting. This is a really good question from Mike, actually. So he sells products that are very commoditized and consistent, like wire and cable, rarely new products. Should he keep going deeper to answer technical questions? Like, should he scheme a markup for every last spec?
Yes. The more you can answer that's not out there, the stronger or more valuable that content is going to seem to Google, and the more likely they are going to surface it higher. So I've mentioned information gain a couple of times, but didn't really explain it. So information gain is this idea that, imagine you've got 10 pages that you're considering for ranking, and they're all on the same topics, but maybe 2 of them are saying something different than the other 10 are. So they're going to boost those 2 a bit more than the other ones because, again, there's more diversity of information. And I believe that the helpful content update brought that more into focus. Google had a score for that, I think, going back to like 2018 or 2019. But I think that they've been like, all right, now is the time to use it because this is a problem that needs to be solved.
There you go. We'll take one more question and then we'll finish up. But thank you all so much for joining today. This has been awesome. And just real quick housekeeping as well. We will send over the replay and the deck presentation via email afterwards. But as Mike mentioned, if you have any questions or want to set up any sort of consultation when it comes to like our generative AI services, your SGE threat report, or just kind of strategizing your next steps, you can find us on iPullRank.com and we can definitely help you out. Last question, Joseph says, can you consider running an analysis on the link authority for what's included in SGE? It may not be just be keyword relevance. So that's more of an ask.
Yeah, I mean, we could, if Ahrefs or SEMrush or Moz or Majestic wants to give us a bunch of free data, I'm happy to do it. But otherwise, I'm not paying for that.
There you go. So we'll get you all those links. Thanks you all for joining. Mike, anything you want to say to anyone on the way out?
Nah, thanks for taking the time to, review this with us. Everybody that shared the article I wrote for SEL, really appreciate that. I think we need to get this information out to more people. It's really important because, there's just a lot of conjecture in our space about this right now. And I think that we spent a lot of time pulling together some real data, and we're going to continue to do so. So yeah, thanks so much for your support.
There you go. That's the one and only Michael King. We will catch you all. Have a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.